You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, my name is Erwin Dekker. It's March 7th today, and we have Professor Klamer with me. We both work in Rotterdam, so it's kind of an odd setting for the both of us because we flew all across the ocean. But I'm actually here for an entire year as a postdoctoral fellow with the F.A. Hayek program, and Professor Klamer is Professor of Cultural Economics at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. He's the author of several books, the most famous of which is perhaps the one in which he interviews economists, conversations with economists from the 1980s. And he showed how personal relationship tactics and strategies were employed in theoretical debates. And out of that work grew his concern with the rhetoric of economics and the way in which graduate students in economics were taught. The most important result of that work was his collaboration with Deirdre McCloskey, which resulted in several edited volumes on the rhetoric of economics, and a great article called One Quarter of GDP as Persuasion, and a book on graduate economics education, The Making of an Economist. And more recently, his book, Speaking of Economics, How to Get into the Conversation. Later, his work, part of his professorship at Erasmus, brought it in to include culture, the study of cultural economics, entrepreneurship, and more recently, the importance of values, which is the subject of his forthcoming book, Doing the Right Thing. So I'd like to start there, Professor Klamer, with your forthcoming book, Doing the Right Thing. What is it about?
Well, the title says a great deal, I hope, about doing the right thing. The subtitle is a value-based economy, and it basically asks the question, and the question of individuals, but also organizations, but also governments, is what's the right thing to do. And my argument is that in all levels, it is about the realization of values. So the question that I can ask myself, but also a director of an organization can ask himself, or the president or prime minister can ask him or herself, is what's important? What is this all about? And then you are going to articulate your values, and then how I'm realizing those values, how I'm making real, or a term that I like to use, how do you valorize it? So if I want to say, want to realize a family because I care about it, I like to have kids, I like to have a wife, that's apparently what's important to me, then I have to figure out how to valorize it, and that usually involves developing relationship, but also the sources like money to finance it. So I think about everything that's needed to valorize that, and that's what the book is about.
So, if it's about values and about doing the right thing, would you still think of it as a book in economics, or would you feel that it's a book in ethics that you're currently working on?
No, I think that in bookshops it will be put under ethics, but my really attempt is to sort of restore economics as a moral science, which it always was, till about the 30s of the last century, when it became more a technical, instrumental science to serve economic policy. But before that, it was much more a way of reflecting on a part of life, and for a while taught by ministers, by the way. But if you certainly look at the work of Adam Smith, that really combines ethical thinking with the thinking of societies and the markets that take place in those societies. And it's also Keynes that still argued that economics is a moral science, and that means, in my terms, about doing the right thing. And that we lost that in the last 80 years doesn't mean therefore that it is not pertinent to economics. So I really, and maybe it is audacious and a little bit arrogant to think that you can do that, but I would like to recover economics as a moral science.
So, if the book is above ethics and economics, sort of as they should be together, does that mean that the book is very critical of economics as it's currently practiced, or does it even seek to bypass it, or is it mainly an effort at reconstructing an older tradition, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, I try to stress the positive part of it. So if you read it, that you really get a sense of what doing the right thing is and what gets involved in doing the right thing. But implicit and sometimes explicit is a critique of standard economics, as I call it. Because I think that standard economics narrows the discussion too much by focusing mainly on the markets and the logic of the market. Whereas in my book, you get a much broader picture, including also sphere of governance, but also the social sphere, the sphere of the oikos, or the home as I call it, and then the cultural sphere. So I basically expand the picture of economics, and that you could consider to be a critique of standard economics. I prefer to stress the positive. That's an expansion, and therefore includes sort of the results of standard economics as just a special case.
And if we're thinking about ethics, is there a particular tradition in ethics that you try to draw on, or is it also critical of some of the ethical thinking that goes on in philosophy departments?
Yeah, the ethics, at least if by articulating doing the right thing, is, as far as I can figure, is sort of an Aristotelian approach. There's a lot sort of revival of virtue ethics, the realization that ethics is about the right behavior. And right behavior is that you act according to certain virtues. And directed, that's important too, because that's what Aristotle describes in his ethics, also directed towards a good life and good society. So I'm stepping in that tradition.
And so if we think about this book as being part of your entire career, right? You're moving close to at least what the official retirement age is in most countries. How would you think of this book in relation to your earlier work on the rhetoric of economics and the way economic students are taught?
Yeah, I think that this is a combination of all the work. At least if I sort of look back, I think I always wanted to write this book, but was not able to. Was first sidetracked because because when I studied economics, I was sort of quite puzzled by what I encountered, and that sort of compelled me to reflect on it. So I did a lot of methodology in philosophy economics, and the conversations came out of that. But of course, also the work on rhetoric. But there too, you could see that rhetoric, by recognizing that economists engage in talk and do much more than applying logic and bringing in the facts, so to say, but that they also use metaphors and tell stories. I actually make a similar move by going beyond the logic, and to suggest that that you have to consider the context of the conversation in which they operate. And that we might want to speak about conversations, and then later I realized that if we think that economists are rhetorical and use them for a variety of ways of tropes, you could say, in rhetoric, but to make their point, then for me it was sort of a small step to think, well, hey, but that same goes on in the economy. When you listen to traders or consumers, for that matter, entrepreneurs, that they argue And they don't do so only on the basis of logic and facts, but they also use metaphors. So I worked at that time with Deirdre McCloskey, then still Donald. And then we had discussions about it. So, well, wait a minute, if we attribute the rhetorical skills to economists, why wouldn't the peasants, as Deirdre studied at that time, or just merchants, have the same? Even more so. And so then the step for me was pretty easily made to go from the rhetoric of economists to think about rhetoric as it operates in economies. And then I got this job as professor of cultural economics, and then was compelled to bring in culture into the discussion, which is not a term that standard economists use. And that also broke things open, because then I was compelled to think about the world of the arts. So I moved away from reflecting on economics, but studied the actual world. And that sort of led to this book, because that really is a different way of looking at economic processes.
So it seems that meaning then becomes the most important thing to study, right? Economists themselves, they understand the meaning of economics of economic actions in a particular way, and seems to be a rival understanding of what people actually do in the market. Right? I remember a famous episode, I think, in the history of economics when one economist, I forget his name now, started doing surveys of what businessmen actually attempted to do, and they didn't seem to care that much about profit, and their pricing strategies seemed to rely very much on rules of thumb. So is that the sort of work that is important for your current perspective?
Yeah, because you can see economists are used to look at markets as instrumental. So and then calling a price is simply an instrumental way of as part of making the deal. But when you study it, as you just referring to, at particular situations, then calling a price can be loaded with meaning. If you point to a bread and say, I would pay $100 for it, then clearly something is going on, that someone is saying so. But if you tell an attractive woman and say, I pay $1,000 to spend the night with you, then also that is in a market setting a normal thing to say, but clearly in this setting rather strange, if not obnoxious and disturbing and offensive. And so you always have to interpret things in their context, and they derive meanings from their context. It's very strange to go up to your wife and ask her for a ride to the airport, and that she says, well, that's fine, but I charge $50 for that. That would be strange. That's not what you do in a setting like this. She might ask you to reciprocate in some way or another, but not in this way. Whereas, of course, in other settings, it would be perfectly logical. But likewise, I say, if you go to a shop and say, well, I'm hungry, can I get some bread out of your shop? That would be illogical, certainly, if you're not going to pay for it. Whereas it would be the perfectly logical thing to do if you're a kid in a home and you're hungry, you just grab for the bread and eat it. And that's what I mean to say, is that these words have meanings that make sense in one setting and become illogical or offensive or silly or stupid in another setting.
Yeah. I want to go back to perhaps a particular episode that I haven't experienced myself, but that's sort of the late 80s, early 90s, when there seemed to be a kind of unique historical moment in economics with a lot of self-reflection.
Yeah.
There were a lot of heterodox schools who were claiming that neoclassical economics was bankrupt, but there also seemed to be a feeling, which I think in retrospect is somewhat justified, that neoclassical economics was experiencing a kind of crisis and a transformation period. It's now far more empirical, where it was much more theoretical then. Of course, all these people were trying to talk to one another. sometimes very aggressively, sometimes very dismissively of others. So I gather that must have helped shape your current perspective as well. Those sort of methodological and philosophy of economics debates that you referred to earlier.
Yeah, no, for me, of course, I started already in the 70s when there was also a lot of ideological discussion. And I became part of a movement that was trying to reflect on the discipline of economics. And that was also inspired by all these disagreements. And so I think we all try to figure out what kind of sciences this economics actually is, and how does it develop, and why does it improve or not, and how come that these different approaches. And then you refer to the period in the 80s that economics was becoming more theoretical. And then David Cohen and I did this book that you're referring to, The Making of an Economist, that first came out as an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. What we actually did is interview graduate students at the major schools. And we found actually that they perceived that the main guarantee for success is to be good at problem solving in mathematics. And that empirical research was very lowly valued, teaching too, by the way. And what even was stunning the outside world is that these students said that knowing the economy was of no relevance for their work. Most people, journalists, sort of were flabbergasted by that. And the Economist wrote about this result. It was kind of nice for us to get that hearing. And then the profession responded by installing a committee to review the graduate program. And whereas we thought that the students were really asking for better writing skills, more historical consciousness, more reflection on the discipline, the outcome was actually that the selection was more strict on mathematical aptitude. And so to prevent all these students coming in who may be more sort of inclined to think about the profession.
Yeah. So the real problem was a selection problem, not a problem with the profession.
Yeah, that's how it was interpreted, and that's also how the practices change. And to me, that of course led to the major disappointment that when I now go to graduate programs and start talking about methodology and philosophy, it's just like we are thrown back in the Stone Age. That their awareness of methodological and philosophical issues is virtually non-existent, or if it exists, it's a very sort of outdated methodology, sort of physics, an old-fashioned physics sort of idea of science. No reflection, no idea of Kuhn and Lakatos or Popper or you name them. Certainly not of rhetoric. So in that sense, we lost it, and it seems that the profession has hardened. I use another term, is becoming more modernistic, although without a real belief in what the purpose of it, because the old modernists really believed that they were going to change the world and make it better. I don't see much of that, although it is changing again. If you see that there are new approaches emerging, I mean, behavioral economics, sort of evolutionary economics, feminist economics, more or less. And more interesting, though, is that you see in new movements, think about the Steve Levitt approach, sort of that theory is being sort of squeezed out or lost. Empirics sort of takes over. And if I oversee the field, I get a rather chaotic picture. All kinds of things are happening, but it's not clear what the purpose is. When I studied economics, it was really clear that we were the intention was to change the world, to make it better. I don't see that very clearly right now.
Well, there is, of course, the modern work which uses methods deriving from medicine as well, right? The randomized control trials. and these people are engaged in quite big engineering processes to improve school systems and the like. So perhaps that's something where there's still a sense of purpose, at least.
Yeah, I don't know. This one I don't know, but again, I do think that some discussions that I see happening are indeed focusing on policy and so on. But here I make another point though, and that's the question is what is the purpose of the science of economics? And that goes back to my work on the speaking of economics, but as also what propelled me to doing the right thing is, and also I do now political work, and I become more aware of it, that actually it's very hard to justify the science of economics in its own terms. To talk about added value or productivity or economic impact, it's very hard to justify all the work that's done in economics to show that it has sort of a productive outcome, like improves the performance of the economy. At the least you would expect that if all these economists doing the work, that it contributes to economic performance. Well, that happens. That we cannot show that that's the case. Some work has been done to do so, but it has not been successful. So that means that we really left unsure as to what the contribution of economics is. And I concluded from my research that economists don't contribute with the results of their research, the outcomes of their research, with the empirical results that they're now so keen on, but more through meanings, by introducing terms that politicians use. That's one. So I see it works more by meanings. But second, I find it actually also strange that all this effort of all these economists and all these departments and think tanks and so are all directed at policymakers who seem overall to have little use for it, because that's what I observed, that all this work comes to nothing, and many economists who have worked in the corridors of power also tell that they are easily squeezed out or ignored at the table, and lawyers then taking over. It's also my experience, by the way, that there is no patience for these kind of economic arguments. So why then targeting the policymakers? And why thinking that's the only reason for doing science? In doing the right thing, I constantly I say, well, there is 99.99% of the people do something else. And like running a business or running a life or running a career or being a professional or exercising a craft or whatever, can economics not also be of service to them? And I speak about economics as having science in general, having a therapeutic effect, that it raises questions that people otherwise would not think of. That's the therapeutic part. And then I think the task of us scholars is to create a framework or design a framework that helps people to think about these questions and in some way or another give direction to their life. And in my picture, that's more than just doing a cost and benefit analysis. And so I try to develop concepts that are really helpful, I hope, to people running their lives.
Yeah. So we are here at the FA Hayek program, which very much studies the Austrian tradition. What to you is the important meaning that comes out of, or the important concepts that come out of the Austrian tradition?
Yeah, I've been in discussion with Austrians actually many years, and I considered Don Lavoie my intellectual friend. And what I always liked in these discussions is that it was open for processes beyond the sort of strictly instrumental processes that neoclassical economics deals with. And that with Don, we often discussed the interpretive processes that involved in markets, that you have to read prices and interpret signals. And that also he was sensitive to the idea of language, the way it operates, or how persuasion operates. So I discussed with him this article about entrepreneurs being persuasive as a special skill. So that openness was clearly there, and it's still here. And but the same is when I read people like Hayek. Mises, I find a great deal in common with what I do now. At the same time, and that's what is, I do think, and that's my critique, that Austrian economics is preoccupied with the logic of the market and sees a great deal and tries to reduce a great deal to that logic, that self-interest behavior, the invisible hand, and also when it looks to public domain, like a public choice, applies that market thinking to those other settings. And that I don't follow. I do think that there is a logic of the market, but next to it there is a logic of governance, and that works differently by rules and by programs and by law. And then there is a social logic. And I have especially different discussions about what the difference between the market logic and the social logic is. And social logic is based on informal relationship. It's based on the principle of reciprocity, but also involves sharing. And that means that in the social sphere, you engage in things like friendship. And friendship is a typical example of sharing. It involves reciprocity, because you do things for your friend and your friend does things for you. But in the end, the point of all that is the shared good, as I say, friendship, that you both own, in a sense. And I claim that these goods are the most important goods. I think also of knowledge or music or community or colleagues. And these are all goods that you share with others, inevitably. For many people, they're very important, but you cannot buy them in the market. The government cannot arrange them. It's really something different. And if you think about friendship and reciprocity, and I have then discussions with Austrians, say, yeah, but in friendship you also have exchange, just like in the market. I say, yeah, it looks like a change, but it is not really. At least certainly not in the market. And one is that I do something for my friend. We don't argue about the terms of trade. We don't have a unit of account because that would be not logical. So I can do even a great deal for my friend, but we leave the counter gesture undefined, on purpose, ambiguous. And it may even that he does something for me years later, and in a way that is not very clear how that compensates what I did, but that's what friendship is about, that you leave these things in the open. And it requires a lot of practical wisdom, I call that phronesis, to deal with that. Because it could be that you do more for your friend than your friend does for you, and at one point that's the end of the friendship. So it requires sort of practical wisdom to negotiate what means to give enough, not too much, not too little. And that is logic that's critically different from the logic of exchange as we know it in the market.
So, in talking about society and friendships and the household, it seems that your work is actually quite close to another central concept from Austrian economics, which is the notion of a spontaneous order. And one could add that people voluntarily associate with each other and they form orders. Remember Roger Scruton writing about the canon that we have in the arts as an example
Yeah.
of a spontaneous order, right? Nobody picked Shakespeare and Dante and Virgil to be in the canon, but nonetheless they are in our literary canon. So does that work inspire you at all, or do you rather think of these things not so much as spontaneous order, but as a different type of order?
The idea of spontaneous or appeals very much to me because it suggests that's to me what happens in the social sphere. People form spontaneously families. They form spontaneous clubs or found churches or scientific communities or music groups or neighborhoods or just keep going. And there's no one who dictates that, no one who determines from above, no authority. And actually, enterprise also you start that way. A couple of friends in a garage start to do something, play around a little bit, and say, "Hey, the movie about Zuckerman and Facebook is very clear on this." That's how these things start. There's instant society spontaneously. All great things start that way, basically. And that's also interesting that first you see how in the valorization, to use my term, it at first gets valorized in the social sphere. People start spontaneously to make art or music, but they then have to find people in the social sphere who appreciate it, can be critical about it, can contribute to it. And that's what you do without any money changing hand or a government get involved. And that's how it comes about. And in a later process, these more formal structures get involved. Organizations, markets, buying and selling. But that's usually in the course of things, in the life of things, only a later stage that comes in. So yeah, spontaneity is the basis of all society.
And of culture, I would say. I want to go back to the sort of movement that I think you, Don Lavoie, and Deirdre McCloskey, and many others, I think Robert Solow was even quite open to it in the 1990s, were part of the rhetoric of economics literature. And I think that part of the point that you guys were making at the time is that the desired change in economics is as much in terms of tone and style as it is in substance. And I think so far we've talked quite a bit about substance, but that notion of tone and style, could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think that's more Deirdre's point than my point, but Deirdre McCloskey, who was, of course, the main person in this, took especially offense to what she calls the sneering that goes on, the sort of the. But she also took offense against indeed sort of the what she called the blackboard economics, sort of the very limited way in which economy is communicated. And what bothered her in particular is the sharp division, the sharp line that economists tend to draw between their discipline as a science and practices as poetry or philosophy. And
but in your work also, right? We see the I word, which we're supposed to avoid in economic or academic writing more generally. We find anecdotes. We find what I would call a conversational style that's not too different from what you would use in a seminar room, rather than the split in style that we see in much of traditional academic work.
Yeah, in my perception, style and substance are very closely related. So the style you adopt because you want to communicate something. So if I use the I in my work and I use personal examples, is because I advocate a different stance from that economists usually take. Usually economists take the stance of the objective scientist who distances him from the scene, so to say, puts himself away from it, and objectifies by doing so the world, and tries to explain and predict it. That's the standard perspective. So you distance yourself. In my book, use the example of the elephant that people look at, and that scientists can have different perspectives on the same elephant. I actually try to imagine what it is if you are inside the elephant, and try to figure out what gets the elephant to move and why he should go in one direction rather than another. And there's different stance, because that means that you have to emphasize with people, with the agents, so you cannot distance yourself, and you really try to figure out what it is to do the right thing. So you also have to involve yourself much more explicitly. And that goes also to argue that knowledge should be relevant somehow, and not towards the policy making necessarily, but also to yourself or to others paying attention to you. And that can only be because you are getting involved in the action. And therefore, I take a very different stance. And so, by using the I actually want to suggest to the reader, how by you, what would mean for you, and how would you apply this in your own life? I apply it in my life, but what does it mean to you? And that's what makes knowledge, I think, relevant, if it can also be personal, if you can recognize it around you. So that's why I also like, when we talk, always to refer to situations right at hand and see whether what we are saying makes sense of what is at hand.
Okay, let me switch gears a little. I would like to talk about one of your entrepreneurial projects, which is the Academia Vitae, a university you started about 10 years ago. What were your goals with setting up your own university at the time?
I came from the United States, where you have a lively liberal arts tradition, to the Netherlands, where you had much less so. I missed that liberal arts tradition. So I thought first I should start sort of a liberal arts college. But I did also a project for a ministry about permanent education. And then it struck me how strange it is that we focus universities on 20 years old. Whereas, and that was my idea, that 45-year-olds might be much more in need of this knowledge than 20 years old. Certainly knowledge in terms of what the humanities provide and the philosophies provide. And Academia Vitae was an academy for life. That was the idea. So it would serve all stages in life. And so I did several programs for professionals. And there I was struck, and my book, Doing the Right Thing, was informed by that, struck by that these people they had no technical questions, but personal questions. They wanted to know what to do, and in all kinds of settings. And they were not so interested in the sort of abstract knowledge that we teach our 20-year-olds. They wanted to learn things that mattered to them. And I figured they wanted to know how to do the right thing, actually, in their own lives, in their companies, in society. And so we read basically canonical text, Aristotle, but also Adam Smith and Hobbes and Plato and Erasmus and a whole variety. And each time we would start with a question that someone has, then go deep in the reading, and in the end try to go back to the question and see whether that reading and the discussion gave some new insight on that question. That was our approach. And yeah, I thought it was fantastic what happened. Found it really inspiring, and so did many other people. But it was very hard to sustain when the recession started, because then companies cut back on their education programs, and it was much harder to get people to come and to pay.
Yeah. It really sounds like a liberal arts project in the sense that you were trying to make perhaps more resilient, or not make, but to help people become more resilient in a way. The program here is called PPE, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Do you think that that's a step in the right direction, a sort of idea that the human sciences are really one?
Yeah. Well, I do think that the human sciences are becoming more important the older we get. We have a hard time getting young kids interested in them, but I have no problem finding 55-year-olds getting interested in them. PP is going in the direction. I think there's still too much politics there. And that sort of bothers me, that science is so focused on politics. There's more in life than politics. There's more knowledge needed than just knowledge for politics, apart from the fact that politicians don't care anyway. So yeah, in my book, in my university, it would be about the good life and the good society.
Currently, Bart Wilson, and I think in the past, Deirdre, and you have also used the concept of humanomics as an alternative to economics. Do you think of that as having a future, or is there a banner that people can rally around?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I in a way, I like the word economics too. If you see in economics the word oikos and home, and then you go back to the original meaning that it had in Aristotle. But yeah, the question is if you ever win that battle. So introducing another term like humanomics calls attention to the difference, and that could make sense. So yes, in that sense, I support it. And the risk is always that you appeal to sort of romantic longings with people. And the economics that I project is, yeah, some people call it romantic, but if I and you are thinking about what it takes to do the right thing, it has also some seriousness to it, and sometimes I think also it's quite pragmatic. I find it much more practical actually than standard economics, but it is closer to life, and in that sense, I can recognize the term humanomics.
So, one other theme that I would like to discuss is that of audience. I remember that in speaking of economics, you use the phrase, whose applause are you seeking? And I think in your own career that has changed quite a bit, but I am quite curious to know whose applause you are seeking with this book, Doing the Right Thing.
Yeah, I always, when I was in the United States, I always sort of was looking at people like Bob Heilbronner, because he was not only having an interesting position at the New School, but also was clearly a public intellectual who would write in the New York Review of Books and so, and was widely read. I mean, you find his books in a normal bookstore, and you have a few more people, of course, Paul Krugman and so. But that was always my hope, that it would not be just the applause of fellow economists, because that was somewhat disappointing. So most economists go to conferences and see that they get a hearing there. So they seek indeed the applause of fellow economists, and for the rest they don't care. But that's not me. And of course I identify and associate with people like Deirdre McCloskey, who also seeks an other audience besides economists. Although for her, conventional economists are more important still than they are for me. But when I went to the Netherlands, I find that there it's much easier to be a public intellectual. It's easier to get invitations for radio and television. And that changed my role somewhat. And I have also read books more for public consumption. But it's always tricky how you sort of negotiate your place in academia among scholars and get their appreciation, because I really seek that appreciation, because my ambition is to contribute to scholarship while not losing the rest, so to say. John Maynard Keynes is another example. Hayek, these people were able to speak to a much broader audience. Milton Friedman did also a very good job at that. And that's what I would emulate. If I'm able to, that's another matter. But that's what I would aspire for, yeah.
So the notion of making a contribution seems very important in the work you currently do. So in terms of talking to your own graduate students or other young scholars, right? One way I read you is figure out what you really want to contribute to. But let's assume for the moment that they roughly have the same goals as you do. So they want to contribute to a broader societal conversation. They perhaps even want to address their fellow human beings as sort of economic citizens and everything. What would you think are good or smart choices to make? And does academia play an important role in the choices they should be making?
Yeah, I usually encourage people like yourself to also to excel in academia. At the same time, also to venture outside academia, because I don't think that you will find that more broader audience when you stay in academia and teach and do research. So one other student of mine, whom I thought and still think of as a great talent, he first worked as a journalist for a couple of years. I thought it was a risky strategy, because it's hard to find your way back into academia after that. But he succeeded, although it set him back for quite a few years. He should have been full professor already quite a while. But because of this stint as a journalist. But what it really had set him back, but it really contributes, though, to his style of writing and his sense of how you can grab a broader public, because that's what he learned as a journalist. I myself did something similar, although I find that more difficult when I was in the United States, because then the campus is really stimulating but also constraining, and it's hard to get away from it and find an audience beyond it. And you have to do that by writing books and article in newspapers and so. Or as Tyler Cohen does, having a blog. He's really successful in becoming this public intellectual. Write op-ed pieces, I would say. And what happens then in countries like the Netherlands, then you get invited to give lectures. And before you know it, you become also part of another conversation, so to say. So my advice is, it's good to have a basis in academia and venture out. Although I must say that I see increasingly the number of people who actually don't bother with academia and sort of develop an intellectual life outside. I think that becomes more possible with the increasing restraints of academic life, with the emphasis on publications and doing rigorous and therefore highly specialized work that some people like and others actually get frustrated with.
Yeah. So to return to this idea that you seek the approval of not just your fellow economists, but of a broader audience, The idea of approval in Adams is also very central in Adam Smith's
Yep.
theory of the moral sentiments, in which, at least in my view, it arguably leads from the approval of your own actions by yourself, via the approval of others, to the approval by God. Ultimately, I would think,
Yeah.
with this notion of benevolence. And I know that your father was a famous minister in the Netherlands. Is the notion of God or the transcendental an important part in your life or in your work? So this notion that we ultimately seek approval not just of others, but of something that's bigger than us?
Yeah, that looms always somewhere in the background. And I do make it quite explicit in doing the right thing. That I say, hey, we can strive for personal goods, social goods, society goods, and transcendental goods. Because I do think that people are spiritual beings and seek something that is beyond the here and the now, seeking the Holy Grail or enlightenment or God's grace, or and some people experience that more explicitly than others, but it's always somewhere there. In doing the right, I try to make it more explicit, and that's also true for myself, because I think that in the end, that's all. If you can ask yourself, what am I doing this for? We end up with the transcendental. And incidentally, I do this work quite a bit with professionals, and I was just surprised that I find that the transcendental gives always trouble. Scientists, scholars don't want to sort of dwell with that. They find it uncomfortable. And where I had the easiest time to sort of define it and identify it was with technicians at the University of Delft, and technical university. When I did this exercise, I do a few exercises exploring this, then I found that for them, the transcendental goal is the overriding one. And that shows itself that they are really in search of the perfect machine, the perfect technique, the perfect material, and everything they do is subordinate to that. It becomes kind of a religion. And it's sort of nice in there, it's sort of naive the way they articulate it, but it becomes so obvious, and to them too, it was for them also came as an insight that they have that transcendental goal. They don't really care about the applications. It's fun is there, but that's not what they do it for. They do it really because they want to see whether this sort of impossible is possible. The equivalent from perpetuum mobile. Can I construct that? That is sort of what they pursue.
If I hear you talk about this, I am tempted to think of some of the things that happen in economics in the second half of the 20th century, when people started looking for the existence of a general equilibrium. It became very much about theoretical truths rather than anything else. Would you say that they were pursuing a transcendental good when they were engaged in the search for the sort of general equilibrium model and its existence?
Yeah, I'm not sure that many of them would have recognized it as such, but it developed in what you could call praxis, what I call praxis. And that's a practice that contains its own goal. So it's pointless then to ask what is that good for. So what I understand from, and I have talked with these sort of general equilibrium theorists, they're really pursuing something, and often something aesthetical. For them, the beauty of it is really an important value. The symmetry of it, and the neatness of the solution. That's also that they will exclaim, "How neat! How perfect! How beautiful!" And when you recognize that, then it's much easier to talk with them, because then it's not so, what are the applications or what policy purpose does it serve? Because that's not what is on their mind. And they're totally engaged in this practice, and that's good enough for them. And usually they have a strong mathematical mindset. And mathematicians have this clearly so, but musicians for that matter too. And it's sort of striking how often when these people engage in these things, that they have a similar affinity for music, and for them, the practical is of no relevance. Yeah, that has a sort of transcendental color to it, right? That is the.
So, if I think of other transcendental goods that people might be striving for, I think in my own work, I developed the idea that we want to contribute to a bigger tradition or a civilization that we're part of. But the way I hear you talk about it now, the notion of transcendental goods, they can even be somewhat dangerous. The pursuit of this one big goal that's out there that makes us disregard questions of relevance or practicalities. Is that a fair reading of what you were just saying, or not so much?
Yeah, but that's why in my model, you always have to. The broader picture always calls attention to the balance that is needed. If my friend who practices Zen, I find sometimes most unpractical. So I was rather amused when he got a child at late age, and I sort of confronted him that he could continue to practice his Zen, but that wouldn't do much good bringing up his child. And now he had to deal with other aspects of life that he never was so interested in his Zen practice. That's the balancing act that you and I have. And it's always dangerous if people latch onto one practice and one logic, ignoring all the others. So if people think that the market is everything, or that the home is everything, or government is everything, or if people think that only personal values matter or only transcendental values, but that is always. That's why I try to at least to have a sort of broader picture with different elements. So if someone highlights and accentuates one, then things get drawn out of context, and that leads to danger. That's right.
Yeah. So 2 questions before we end this interview. The first is, I think recently we've seen quite a few almost self-help books by economists. They frequently come from the incentive literature, and they ask us to set smarter incentives in our own lives, either by committing to some saving scheme or perhaps even given the people that we do economic business with better incentives. Do you see your own book as being at all related to these self-help books that are currently on the market? Is that an issue, or?
Yeah, that's. I would not be pleased if my book ends up in that section of the book shop, but it has an element to it because it does make you reflect on your own life, and it makes you aware of certain aspects of your life that you otherwise might not be aware of. But if I look at the self-help books on economics, then that's what Deirdre McCloskey would say, prudence-only kind of advice, how to be prudent. And that's only part of it, that you are taking into account the cost and that you figure out how you deal with the monetary issues. But in my book, I suggest that life is about a great deal more than that. And for example, if you care about love, then you better figure out how to have a loving relationship. If you want to make art, you better think about how to be part of an artistic community. And that requires processes that are quite different from the prudence-only approach of these economic self-help books. And self-help books have, of course, gotten a bad name. But in the end, any philosophy book or any sort of humanities book that in some way or another doesn't contribute to a realization of the good life, I ask, then what else does it want to aspire? So, my purpose is to figure out how you can contribute to a good life and a good society.
Yeah. Okay. You now spend a week here at the Hayek program in the Mercatus Center and all around George Mason campus, and I think also back at George Washington. What did you appreciate most of your all the activities here and the things going on with the program?
Yeah, for me it's a warm bath because of course I still teach in Holland, but in the Dutch culture, and I taught for many years here in the United States. And what I always remember, and now fortunately confirmed, that there is here sort of a culture of intellectual discourse, where you engage, you are critical, you don't hold back, you are honest, but you are serious about it. And we read each other's work and we critique it. And to me, that is incredibly inspiring. So I'm very pleased. And it's also sort of nostalgia, because I'm reminded of the old times when Don Lavoie and so was still here. And to see that it really gives me a good feeling that spirit is still here and alive. And so that's actually the most important thing, apart from it's always when you go back to a place where you were years before, that brings all the old feelings and you're reminded of what you left behind. So that is doing that too for me. But the high point is really the liveliness of the intellectual discussion here. And in my own terms of my own book, there's a great shared good that people share here. And not everyone may always be aware what a great source that is. A great source for inspiration, for intellectual work. And that's, of course, also what brings you here, that you also can sort of draw on this source and benefit from it and contribute to it, because that is what you do by being here. So, I'm very pleased that this exists. It has a great option value for me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Klamer, for this great interview.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.